Hello everyone and welcome back. I am Duke Silver and welcome into our third retro review bracket. If you are new here, once a month we are taking 8 random retro games from a pool submitted by the community and pitting them against one another in a single elimination bracket. Each game gets a half hour on stream, then we vote on which game moves on until there's only a single game left standing. The final game gets a full playthrough on stream as well as a video recap here on the YouTube channel. Check out the video for the winner of our first bracket, DuckTales, and while you're there, why not subscribe to stay up to date on these brackets as we do them. Normally I'd plug the winner of the previous bracket there, but our Alundra playthrough is still ongoing as of the time of this recording. Look out for that video soon. Also, if you want to add to our growing pool of games, feel free to leave a game in the comments or join the Discord and post in the Retro Review suggestion channel. Alright, let's get into the bracket. This time the 8 games vying for the top spot are Metal Gear Solid VR Missions for the PS1, Fatal Frame for the PS2, Final Fantasy XII for the PS2, Dragon's Lair for the Sega CD, Darkwing Duck for the NES, Dungeons & Dragons Shadow over Mystara, which was originally an arcade game, Pokemon Puzzle Challenge for the Game Boy Color, and finally Body Harvest for the N64. Alright, matchup 1 is Metal Gear VR Missions versus Fatal Frame. I don't really do horror games in general, so Fatal Frame definitely stressed me out. It's a horror game where you use a camera to fight off ghosts. Metal Gear Solid VR Missions is exactly as it sounds. Essentially you're doing training missions as the main character from the mainline Metal Gear games. I've never played through any of those mainline games, but I found this pretty enjoyable. It's basically a puzzle game with stealth and action elements. We got through a fair amount of missions in our time, and it left me wanting to check out the mainline games for the first time. I think chat enjoyed both to some extent, but Fatal Frame was the clear winner this time with a vote of 3-1. Matchup 2 is Final Fantasy XII versus Dragon's Lair. Dragon's Lair is a port of a classic arcade game where there are only 5 inputs and you just have to choose the correct one at the correct time. Final Fantasy XII is of course the 12th mainline entry of one of the biggest video game franchises in the world. We didn't get a lot of gameplay in with our half an hour, it was mostly cutscenes, but what I played I did enjoy. It is worth noting that this is not the Zodiac Age version of the game, as that version will be played in another series I'm doing, where I'm playing through every Final Fantasy. A link to that will be in the description. I think the game looked really good for the PS2, especially in the cutscenes, but that is the norm for Final Fantasy games. The combat system is really interesting to me. Seamlessly going from fight to fight while still retaining turn-based elements is a really cool system I'd love to see iterated on in newer Final Fantasies. I loved 15 and 16, but I also really hope the RPG elements aren't wiped out completely. The fact that we have the full series playthrough and Alundra, which is a longer playthrough already ongoing, contributed to people not wanting to vote for FF12, but we still end up with a tie. I don't vote in the polls, so I act as the tiebreaker when situations like this arise. And while I love the Final Fantasy franchise, we do have the full series playthrough ongoing, and I felt Dragon's Lair was charming enough for me to go with the non-Final Fantasy title here. So, Dragon's Lair moves on. Matchup 3 is Darkwing Duck versus Dungeons & Dragons Shadow over Mystara. Shadow over Mystara is a really cool beat-em-up, originally in arcades. Darkwing Duck plays a lot like DuckTales. It is of course a side-scrolling platformer, but in this one you have a gun. The game looks a lot better than DuckTales though, with some cool looking cityscapes. The platforming sections weren't particularly challenging, but some of the enemies felt a bit too tough. You can mostly just run past them though. We saw a couple cool boss fights in our time, including this one where a cloud continually cycles across a moon, rapidly changing this poor duck into a were-duck over and over again, while we just shoot him from afar. Darkwing was by no means a bad game, but the novelty of Shadow over Mystara allowed it to dominate the vote 5-1. Our final matchup of round 1 is Pokemon Puzzle Challenge versus Body Harvest. Pokemon Puzzle Challenge is a sort of sequel to the N64's Pokemon Puzzle League, which I may have 100%ed on Retro Achievements. Body Harvest is a sort of open world action game. The textures in this game were almost non-existent, but given the limitations of the N64, I was impressed with how much was in this game, and how big the map was. The whole point of the game is to run around, saving the general populace from giant bug-like aliens. The aiming was janky, but the vehicles actually controlled pretty well. It was a lot of fun just kind of running around the map, taking out bugs and entering buildings and just seeing what was out there. It really felt like this game was ahead of its time, but was limited by the technology of the platform it was on. And while I had a ton of fun with our time during this game, the chat spoke and Pokemon Puzzle Challenge wins the vote 4-2. With round 1 in the books, it's time to pit some winners against each other. Semifinals matchup 1 is Fatal Frame vs Dragon's Lair. Fatal Frame again is a camera-based horror game, like Pokemon Snap if the Pokemon were terrifying. Dragon's Lair does not have a lot going on by today's standards, but to be fair, it was released in 1983. The game is oozing with charm though, as it is entirely hand-animated by the great Don Bluth, who brought you some classics you might recognize, including The Land Before Time and The Secret of Nim. The only inputs you have are up, down, left, right, and an action button, which might just be a sword button. As events unfold in this essentially playable cartoon, you have to select the correct input for each prompt. A lot of trial and error, but once you get the inputs all in a row, it's very satisfying seeing it all play out. This was the Sega CD version, so it doesn't look great compared to the original, but was a close enough approximation to the original arcade version. This vote ended in yet another tie, so of course I had to be the one to choose which one moves on. I think Dragon's Lair is an interesting and important piece of gaming history, but I think Fatal Frame will make for a more enjoyable playthrough, so I decided that's the one that gets to move on to our finals. Semi-final 2, D&D Shadow over Mystara vs Pokemon Puzzle Challenge. I was really surprised at how fun Shadow over Mystara was. I usually am not super into beat-em-ups, but the plethora of different ways to interact with the world really had me engaged. During our first half hour with Pokemon Puzzle Challenge, I did manage to beat the game on hard, which I found out later is actually the middle difficulty, keeping in line with its predecessor, Pokemon Puzzle League, having 2 hidden difficulties. This game is essentially a zoomed in and simplified Puzzle League, so I took to it quickly. Also, for those unaware, this is just a Pokemon skinned match 3 game where you can only swap blocks horizontally by 1 space. So you have to move quickly to make combos and set up chains, which is most of the fun, the fast-paced nature of it anyways. Fun fact, these games are spiritual successors to Tetris Attack on the SNES. I guess seeing me crush this game in round 1 was only impressive for a short while, as Shadow over Mystara wins once again in overwhelming fashion, 5 votes to 2. Alright, we are on to the finals. It's just Fatal Frame and Shadow over Mystara now. Shadow over Mystara was a big chat favorite throughout the bracket, and for good reason. This game is doing some really fun things in the beat-em-up genre. The inventory and spell slot system in particular add a lot of tools to engage with combat in this game. I would say the difficulty is also above average in the context of this being an arcade game, and probably designed to eat quarters. We did have unlimited coins at our disposal though, which trivialized the game for the most part, but the classic D&D monsters and charming visuals make for a fun playthrough still. Fatal Frame's story, from what I can tell so far, is a boy goes missing while investigating a haunted mansion. He seems to have been taken by a ghost with way more hands than is necessary, and his sister follows in his footsteps to try and find him. We have to use a camera to fight off ghosts in frankly upsetting combat encounters. The whole mechanic is built around letting them approach for as long as possible before taking the photo at the right moment. We also use the camera to solve puzzles around the mansion, using it to uncover hidden doors and things of that like. And so we are on to our final vote, and this one was dramatic right to the end. D&D had the 1 vote lead for almost the entire poll duration, but in literally the last second, someone added a vote to tie the results. Also, this marks the 2nd time in a row Fatal Frame is tied in the poll, and for the 2nd time in a row, I'm actually choosing Fatal Frame as the winner. And there we have it, Fatal Frame is the winner of our 3rd retro review bracket. Now you might wonder why I kept choosing to let Fatal Frame go through when earlier I said I don't really do horror games, and that's actually the reason. This whole bracket series is about playing other people's suggestions and playing games I might not choose myself. Also, I just feel like it's about time I play through a horror game, you know? Even just so I can say I did it. Because Shadow over Mystara is so short and was such a favorite though, I decided we're going to do a playthrough of that as well. Its runtime is between 1 and 2 hours, so it should make for a fun single stream endeavor. As always, this was a lot of fun to do, and we had a really strong group of games this time around. I think a lot of these games could have been winners in different brackets. We do these bracket streams and subsequent playthroughs live on Twitch, so drop a follow over there if you want to get notified when we go live. Also, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like, a comment, or subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps a lot. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.